Well, good morning, Gary. Good morning, Sven. And thank you for joining for episode 2 of our Wabingston Clergy Klatch. The lessons for today that we're going to talk about are for Sunday, October 11th, track 1. That's Exodus 32, Philippians 4, and Matthew 22. So let's jump in and get started. From Exodus 32, verses 1 through 14. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by yourself, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." Well, what do y'all think about that reading this morning?
Well, it's interesting, coming on the heels of last week's Exodus reading, where we get the 10 Commandments, and the first commandment is, "You shall make no other gods before me." It's like, first thing we do. let's just go down these commandments and violate them one at a time.
What about you, Gary? What's your first impression on it?
It's funny hearing you read it. What struck me was all this gold that they had. The slaves coming out of Egypt have all this gold on their ears, and of course the connection between idolatry and money, and the ways that we want comfort and ease with money and security. Security on the side of the mountain when there's fire going on up above where Moses is. That sense that if we can't find what we want the easy way, we're going to find it somehow. If we can't find what we want with God, then we're going to find it.
I think it's interesting because, like Sven, you mentioned the 10 Commandments. For the reader, that actually functions more as an aside, where Moses has like popped out of the Israelites and is talking to God, and we are privy to that conversation. But the Israelites don't actually know that they're breaking the law yet, because Moses hadn't gone down the mountain, that he was still up there, and they were acting at some level, they were acting like the Egyptians, right? The calf was an Egyptian god that they were worshiping in the way that they saw, well, for the last 400 years that other people worshipped. Mm-hmm. And so now they're replicating that. They violated the law without knowing it, and God seems to hold them accountable to it.
Yeah. So that makes me think, and not having looked at the text that close, that makes me think that the way that God is deciding things knows what our human proclivities are. I mean, so God is already telling Moses, you don't know this, but way down there, I know they're going to start making idols and other gods. And so here's my first one. And so, it's like I can imagine Moses having that aha moment, like, oh, this is why that was so important. And so it also occurred to me, like the idol. I think the pattern of idolatry is the same in our human condition as we see in Exodus. So like we take what is close to us and controlled to us and valuable to us, gold, rings, cash, whatever that is, and we make idols of things that we want to be our God. And then we gather together with people of like mind and we form this little social group. And so whether it is, just name the idol out there, it's like the pattern seems to be the same. It seems to be, oh, let's use what's important to us. Let's raise up something we're going to put ahead of everything else. And then let's gather our community around us that we can all say, yeah, this is great.
There's also the sense that the commandments haven't come down the mountain yet, but the truth of God is written on our hearts too. And I suspect somewhere deep inside these people, they know they're going for something that's not quite right. I mean, it's what they rejected in Egypt, and yet now they're out in on the side of this mountain. It looks a whole lot better to them.
Well, I think that's the next part of the story where Moses comes down and just lights them up, and we're going to take this calf that you just made, we're going to melt it down, and I'm going to pour the gold down your throat.
Yeah.
That it's pretty vile. And that, I mean, but that sort of not quite living by the sword and dying by the sword, but you live by your idolatry, you're going to die by your idolatry.
Yeah.
And that we seem to have a stern warning. The other thing that stood out to me is the conversation between God and Moses, that God almost does what Eve did in the garden, right? So Adam misplaces blame, Eve misplaces blame, and God is like, the people that you led, Moses, and then God flips it back and he says, oh no, they're the people that you led. That we have sort of like, no one wants to take responsibility for this. We have Moses sort of acting as God's sort of life coach, saying, well, let's not sort of like kill the people. You're going to get a really bad reputation if you do that. And that it's the characterization of God from a literary standpoint is so interesting. How passionate God is in a desire for purity of God's own people. That it seems, I know I'm reading The Righteous Mind right now, and Sven, I'm pretty sure you're into it as well, that purity is one of those values that that the author argues runs through and across human cultures. And it's certainly something that God seems to value quite highly.
Yeah, it makes me think of how we are made in God's image in that way, but also how with this incident, and also in a passage from earlier with Abraham, how God is willing to be open. So there's a standard that is expressed, but then it's like, okay, well, there's not perfection here. So there might be this ideal of purity, but there's also this understanding that it is not pure. And so how do Moses and also Abraham are allowed to enter into this negotiation where we see other dimensions of God's being and providence and grace. Yeah.
I mean, that to me is at some level the mystery of the incarnation. As we're getting ready to approach Christmas, it's that God willingly stepped into the impurity. And that Mary, being full of grace, did that. And that there's that weird line between being complete, being perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, while also sort of saying, I don't really expect you to be perfect. That's quite an aspirational goal, but let's not let perfect be the enemy of good here.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, in many ways, one of the things about this conversation between Moses and God here, even God doesn't seem particularly perfect. And of course that it's troubling to us to want to understand God as perfect, but there's something also kind of releasing about having a God that gets angry, and again in that incarnational way, that if Moses becomes a life coach for God, it's almost that change of position that we are given this great gift of being able to be engaged in God's work so deeply that we're in conversation with God, and actually what we say matters.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're to imagine that conversation as Moses's internal dialogue with God, right, rather than a booming voice from on high saying, I'm going to kill those darn Israelites, but if Moses's sort of subconscious playing out, Moses putting words into God's mouth, because Moses is so fed up with the Israelites that you can hear Moses sort of reasoning out, what is it God would have me do?
Mhm. I don't have an answer to this, but I wonder, is there any significance in it being a calf? Is there any significance in it being of that animal? Was that a Egyptian motif? Was that?
I
I mean, I
believe it
think.
was. It was also one of the plagues
Oh, you're right.
against the livestock.
Yeah.
And so that, I think if you look at the plagues and how the plagues functioned as essentially a fight between Yahweh, God, and Pharaoh, sort of mediated through Moses, that each of the plagues is an assault on an Egyptian deity.
Mm-hmm.
And so at some level, I think the choice of reincarnating the calf is not just a, hey, this is what I think the God of Abraham looks like. It is a, hey, there was this other God over here that did pretty well for us. Maybe we should call on him right now.
Right. Is that hearken? Let's go back to what we knew to be safe, or symbolize something for us. That's helpful. Yeah.
We should have to say you're in the wilderness. Like, there isn't a constant perpetual source of food, and presumably you've taken what livestock you've had with you.
Right.
It makes sense that you're offering a sacrifice to preserve the one thing that you've got that's actually keeping you alive.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just saying, from a standpoint of, I think of the Israelites being much more sheep and goat people than cow and horse people.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my own bias.
I don't know. All I can think about when I hear that is the Prince of Egypt.
Yes.
That's informed my imagination oh so well.
Yes. Yeah. Which is actually pretty close to the text telling of the story too. I mean, aside from other animated interpretations, or actually Hollywood interpretations.
The other telling of it, the Exodus Gods and Kings, is actually fascinating. I think it's well done. When I would teach, I would have my students watch that. It asks some beautiful questions. For instance, the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh confronts Moses and says, how do you worship a God that does this? And of course, Moses responds back, you are the God that did that.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's beautiful, but it was able to vocalize a lot of sort of internal questions that I know I felt myself have when I was or read.
Because that dialogue is not in the text, but it certainly does help us wrestle with the text in a way. Yeah. And understand. Yeah.
All righty. Well, any final thoughts before we move to Philippians?
No.
All righty. Well, Gary, you want to read Philippians for us and take it away?
All right, this is chapter 4, verses 1 through 9 in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord. In this way, my beloved, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. There you go. A few familiar passages there.
Yeah, I can hear the hymn in my head. Or yeah, just the tune started coming out like as you're reading that. Be careful for nothing.
I love it. I mean, I love the end of Paul's letters because he just sort of gets this sort of mesmerizing quality in his rhetoric that is so good.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's this like swell at the end that it's like, it's all going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to call you out for everything in between, but it's going to be okay.
It's interesting that.
Go ahead.
Yes, Sven, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting that in the middle of the exhortations here, he does call out on these two ladies who are leaders in the church and maybe leaders even beyond Philippi, who seem to have a disagreement, but there's no more about it there beyond that they, if they just do the rest of these exhortations, I guess everything will be okay.
It's sort of like Medea from the Medea series, just naming it. Just I'm just going to name you, and you know who you are. I want you to straighten up now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd heard years ago that when Paul dictated many of his letters and would walk back and forth to one article I read or lecture I heard says you could probably guess the size of the room by how long the phrasing were, and the same lecture was saying that perhaps it was that at the end of the letter the scribe sort of looked at Paul like, really, you're going to say this, which then led to this, building up and sort of the reaching its climax of conclusion and joy. So I think about the community that's in the room when Paul is dictating this, writing it. The community that is then hearing it is in the room as they're hearing these admonitions and encouragements. And it's really about how do we, not as individuals, but as community, as members of the one body, do these things. And so I think it challenges us to look at those last lines. pure, pleasing, excellence, continue those things, which are, how do we strive to put aside the individual and to build up community in that way?
I was thinking about that in a different way from this and talking about Euodia and Syntyche, and that I think Paul generally gets a really bad rap with women, that people sort of say that he was sexist and this, that, and the other. And I'm sure by today's standards, we would probably judge him that way. But at some level, I think he's probably quite progressive for his time and validating the ministry of these women and saying, absolutely. And that any of you that are holding it against them, that they're women, you need to let that go, because these are children of God and they're working a lot harder than you are. Is what I hear is the subtext in this.
Yeah.
And I think that litany of exhortation seems to be do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. Right? Treat people well. And you don't really need any more explanation than because that's what you do.
And this notion of the book of life, this notion of something that is bound and written and held and valued. I just love that. I just love that idea.
People often hear the last bit of this, I think, and because Paul says, just act like me and you'll be fine. And people hear that, and the other thing that Paul gets when he's not being accused of being sexist is that he gets accused of just being a little too full of Paul. And the thing I always think of when I hear this is just remember that the Gospels are not even around yet. I mean, all that Paul can show is to tell stories of Jesus or show what he is doing as a way of finding the way to live into the gospel. And so I think he's really doing all right there.
Particularly, I mean, I wonder how many people in Philippi knew him before the conversion. And that how big was his reputation? Because it seems like in Acts, he had a pretty big reputation for being a pretty zealous individual. And did that move all the way up into Greece? Who knows? But if nothing else, he did more or less evangelize a third of the known world at the time. I mean, he did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
And he managed to do it with quite a bit of grace.
And persistence, yeah.
And persistence. Yeah. And that even if his reputation didn't precede him prior to the conversion, that's still an unknown thing. To do this, to have a new zealousness in the face of the Roman emperor,
right,
is pretty impressive.
Yeah. And to loop back on something earlier, is if you evangelize a third of the known world, and you've been in all these communities, met all these people, to remember specific people in here is one of the things he does. So what does it feel like to be Euodia or Syntyche in these times? Like it's like a shout out. It's like, ooh, I got a shout out from Kanye or something. I mean, so how do you equate that in today's society? You got one knows so many people.
So it's a retweet.
It's a retweet, yeah.
Well, y'all, my Zoom just told me we've got 10 minutes left. So we need to move on to the gospel.
Move to the gospel, yeah.
All right, let me read Matthew chapter 22 for us. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatted calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' They made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, "The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." Okay, let's go to a wedding. What do you think?
I don't think I have the right dress to wear. It's amazing to me that how much violence there is in this parable. It troubles me that when people don't come to the party, they are destroyed. And it of course this is it's as we were saying with the Exodus thing. In many ways, it's Pharaoh that brings it on himself. It's but it does sort of stir up the heart a little bit to have to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Scott, what were you about to say?
I was going to say that I find the two stages of judgment interesting. That I think even, particularly in American Christianity, we think we're kind of one and done. Once we're through, we're in, and that's it. And we can sort of let it all go. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be suggesting, if nothing else, that there's a perpetual awareness of conduct. And that it's not just good enough to get brought into the wedding banquet. You got to dress the part. Mm-hmm. And that you can't just show up wearing a tie-dye t-shirt. Mm-hmm. I hear it a little bit of naming, not quite hypocrisy, but in hearing you read it this time, Sven, I heard it more as like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Like some intentional deception, not just ill-preparedness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and that goes back to the context, Scott. Remember, the context is, and this was a few weeks ago when we heard this, but Jesus has cleansed the temple, and the authorities come and say, "By what authority do you do this?" And he says, "Well, if you tell me where John's authority came from, I'll tell you." And they go back and forth, and so there's that intentional that sheep's clothing motif there, because they know the answer, but they don't give the answer. And then he tells these three parables. Last week was the vineyard, and then 2 weeks ago was the two sons. One says go, but he doesn't. One says he won't, but he does, kind of thing. So it's that notion of how did these three parables, we get them one at a time, but how these three parables, so I go back to that notion of the authorities being deceiving.
Yeah, I think sometimes in our own day, we imagine if we belong to a church and we show up most Sundays, then we're doing what needs to happen. And I always love to quote Frederick Buechner, who once said, "I can go stand in my garage as long as I want, but I'm not going to become a car. And I can go to church as often as I want, but I'm not going to be a Christian that way."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost reminiscent of Aaron being the false high priest that makes the calf. That the Israelites were brought into the wedding banquet, albeit the banquet was taking place in the wilderness, and that Aaron dressed up, or he dressed up as the high priest, but really he wasn't clothed. He didn't have the right motivation and the right heart to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I also find it interesting the harsh judgment of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That there seems to be sort of an indifference towards the people. Well, I guess not really. He destroyed the city, and the people that didn't show up that were invited got sort of kicked out and removed. But almost the punishment for the one that showed up in sheep's clothing was even more harsh. That it wasn't just, I'm going to burn your house to the ground. It's, I'm going to banish you to darkness.
Yeah. You're bound. Yeah.
So
It is that notion of the invitation being very wide and being very encouraged. Because repeatedly the slaves go out again and again and again. And it's interesting to me that we don't hear anything about those people who did come to the wedding banquet, those who came early on, who said, oh, I got an invitation. I'm not going to do my business. I'm not going to my farm. Oh, the slaves are coming. I'll meet them on the road, passing them on the way to the wedding hall. So they're, somebody's in the wedding hall, but we never hear about them. I think that's intentional. I think it's, raised the question of how do we look at that ongoing discipleship, that ongoing response to God's call.
like that's it, the ongoing discipleship.
Yeah.
Perfect phrase there.
Yeah, one of the phrases in the Philippians that we didn't talk about was let your gentleness be known to everyone, or let your moderation be known. And that idea that somehow you go to the wedding feast knowing you're broken, and knowing that you have to be vulnerable, knowing that your clothes may not be perfect enough and right enough, and yet you go because you need to go for the grace.
That's it.
Yeah.
Alrighty, y'all. Well, thank you for today for our conversation. And if y'all are all right, I'll pray us out with the collect for the Sunday of Proper 23. May the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, we pray that your grace may always precede and follow us, that we may continually be given to good works. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Alrighty, y'all. See you next week.